Some killers don't just murder. They plan, they prepare, they build. And when they finally act, it's not out of rage. It's out of design. This isn't about madness. It's about systems. About predators who created entire infrastructures around their crimes, who didn't need attention or headlines, just time and a locked door. The first didn't hunt in alleys or sneak into homes. He brought the victims to him, isolated, controlled, erased. He built his setup piece by piece, installed the restraints himself, tested every tool, recorded every second. And when law enforcement finally got inside, what they saw wasn't chaos. It was blueprinted torture, perfected over years. David Parker Ray operated out of a trailer in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. What he built inside became known as the toy box. It looked like any other mobile trailer from the outside, but the second investigators unlatched the door and stepped inside, they were hit with a scene that would burn itself into law enforcement history. The walls were lined with diagrams of human anatomy, surgical instruments arranged like museum pieces, hooks suspended from the ceiling, pulleys rigged to shackles, electrical devices labeled in meticulous handwriting, and a gynecological chair bolted into place at the center. The entire trailer was a torture lab, complete with soundproofing, video cameras, and a recording system that documented nearly everything. Investigators described it not as a crime scene, but a facility, a purpose-built structure designed specifically for prolonged, systematic human torture. Ray's method wasn't frenzied, it was procedural. His victims were abducted, drugged, and restrained. He used combinations of barbiturates and hypnotic agents to suppress memory and resistance, allowing him to maintain control over long periods without killing too quickly. Many victims were left so disoriented that even if they were released, they could barely recall what had happened. Others were not released at all. Ray worked with at least one known accomplice, his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, who assisted in luring and subduing victims. The two developed a routine, identifying vulnerable women, often sex workers or hitchhikers, offering rides or assistance, and then driving them to the trailer. Once inside, the procedure began. Victims were stripped, chained, and subjected to psychological breakdowns before the physical torture even started. One of the most disturbing elements discovered was an audio cassette tape labeled for use during the intake phase. On the tape, Ray described in graphic detail what the victim would endure. He played the recording as the victims lay restrained, injecting a level of psychological terror that stripped away hope before the real suffering began. The tools inside the toy box weren't random. Each one had a label, a log, and a set of notes. He kept handwritten journals documenting his actions, cataloging pain response, restraint methods, and preferred tools for different phases. It wasn't just cruelty, it was process. Ray even made modifications to standard devices, customizing them for his experiments. There were clamps attached to battery wires, modified saws, retractable hooks, and surgical blades dulled intentionally to prolong suffering. Investigators would later say it was like walking into a lab built by someone who didn't see his victims as people, but as specimens. What made the case even more chilling was how long it had gone unnoticed. Ray had operated for years, possibly decades, without detection. Elephant Butte was a small, quiet area. People minded their business. Ray worked as a mechanic, a part-time park ranger, and never drew attention. He blended in. His dogs kept people away from his property. His home was surrounded by fencing. He didn't take trophies in the traditional sense. Instead, he recorded. Dozens of videotapes were recovered, each showing hours of restrained women in various stages of torment. The tapes were stored alongside logbooks and photographs, some dating back more than a decade. Many of the women were never identified. In fact, Law enforcement believes that Ray may have had over 60 victims, though only a handful were ever confirmed. Some were dumped in remote areas, others possibly buried or dissolved. No official body count was ever established, and Ray never confessed to murder directly. What brought the entire operation to a halt was a single escape. One woman, kept shackled for days inside the toy box, managed to break free when Ray left his keys unattended. She fled the trailer, bleeding and barely dressed, and ran into the road where a passerby stopped. Law enforcement followed her directions and entered the property. What they found ended up being one of the most disturbing discoveries in U.S. criminal history. It took weeks to process the evidence. Specialists were called in. Psychological trauma units were established just for officers and staff who had to handle the case materials, not because of blood, but because of the cold, structured nature of what Ray had built. This wasn't a serial killer lashing out. It was someone who had created an entire infrastructure around human captivity. Every inch of space had been optimized for control, and every tool had a place. In court, Ray denied the worst of the charges, but the physical evidence left no room for doubt. He was convicted, but never served out a full sentence. In 2002, shortly after his sentencing, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack. No public closure, no further confessions, just silence. But the images of the toy box and the footage he left behind continue to haunt those who saw them, not because of what was done, but because of how carefully it was done. After the arrest, the full weight of what David Parker Ray had constructed began to unfold in the harsh fluorescent lights of evidence rooms and forensic labs, where teams sifted through the wreckage of a crime scene that wasn't a scene at all, but a fully functioning operation. The toy box, once sealed off with chains and patrolled by dogs, was now a dissected blueprint for prolonged captivity and torture. Investigators cataloged every piece with clinical precision. Over 1,000 items were logged, from surgical scalpels to custom-built restraint rigs, diagrams, and nearly 100 audio and video tapes. Many of the recordings were unwatchable without long-term psychological support for law enforcement personnel. What emerged was not a story of a man who killed in the shadows and ran from consequences, but of someone who believed he had created the perfect system, one where victims couldn't identify him, where evidence was controlled, and where the logistics of suffering were streamlined to eliminate risk. The reality was darker still. Ray hadn't just built a soundproof trailer in a remote location. He had created a self-contained ecosystem of pain, complete with scripting, documentation, modification cycles, and disposal protocols. The gynecological chair at the center of the toy box wasn't just symbolic. It was the focal point of a process that began with mental submission and ended, in some cases, with complete erasure. Many of his victims were never officially reported missing. They were already living on the margins. Sex workers, runaways, drug users, individuals who could disappear without immediate consequence, whose families had already lost track of them, or who had no one looking in the first place. Ray chose them for this exact reason. His hunting ground wasn't a location, it was a demographic, and he understood how to navigate that vulnerability without raising alarms. Law enforcement later admitted that Ray could have continued indefinitely had the final victim not escaped. She had been kept drugged, tied up, and tortured inside the trailer for 3 days. When Ray accidentally left the keys to her chains within reach, she took her only chance. Bloodied and half-naked, she broke out, ran down the road, and flagged down help. The man who stopped for her didn't know it then, but he had just ended one of the longest, uninterrupted torture operations in American criminal history. Once inside the trailer, officers quickly realized they weren't dealing with a typical offender. The tapes showed Ray calmly adjusting cameras, speaking into microphones, reading from prepared scripts, and conducting the abuse like a clinical experiment. The logs included dates, names, or pseudonyms, and notes about which drugs produced better compliance, which restraints prevented bruising, which tools minimized fatal injury. He documented everything, not out of pride, but to improve efficiency. And when they examined his property, they found more than just the trailer. There were hidden compartments in his home, makeshift burial areas suspected to hold remains, and maps marking remote desert locations, where some investigators believed victims were disposed of. Ray never admitted to murder, but forensic evidence, blood, tissue samples, fragments of clothing, suggested otherwise. At least 14 separate female DNA profiles were found inside the trailer. Some were eventually matched to missing persons. Others were never identified. The case spread through law enforcement circles like a virus. Officers passed information to surrounding counties, hoping to connect the toy box tapes to their own unsolved cases. But without confessions, without full bodies, and with the victims rendered voiceless through amnesia-inducing drugs, the puzzle never fully came together. Only a few survivors came forward. Some were located through partial memories triggered by public media broadcasts, others from matching tattoos, scars, or voice recognition from the tapes. Their accounts were nearly identical: abduction, drugs, restraints, and the voice. Ray's calm, flat delivery describing what would happen to them next. Those voices still haunt the agents who processed the recordings. One agent described it as watching a man teach a class on dismantling a person. The psychological profile built around Ray was clear. He was not impulsive, not rage-filled, but cold, methodical, and deeply invested in the refinement of his process. The trailer was the final product of years of development. Some of the tools had been machined at home, others were modified commercial items. His knowledge of anatomy suggested deep study. He had never worked in a medical profession, but understood physiology well enough to prolong pain without causing immediate death. Survivors described the sessions as episodes of unending precision, never random, never frenzied. Every movement had a purpose, and Ray never rushed. He filmed his crimes with tripod setups and multi-angle views, recording not just the suffering, but his own involvement. This documentation obsession became both his legacy and his undoing. During the trial, prosecutors presented these tapes, along with the evidence logs and testimony from the victims who had survived. Ray refused to cooperate. He showed no emotion throughout. At one point, he reportedly smirked as the charges were read aloud. He never apologized, never offered explanation. His only defense was that the encounters were consensual, that the victims were willing participants in extreme bondage scenarios. But no jury could look at the condition of the victims and the elaborate methods used and believe that claim. The courtroom itself became a site of trauma. Jurors, attorneys, even seasoned police officers struggled to stay composed. Some requested counseling, others left law enforcement entirely after the trial. The sentence came down hard, 224 years in prison, but Ray would serve almost none of it. Less than a year into his sentence, he collapsed and died of a heart attack while being transported for a routine medical procedure. For many, it felt like a stolen outcome. There would be no extended imprisonment, no second trial for suspected murders, no final answers. Just death, sudden and anticlimactic. And yet, even in death, Ray left behind the damage he'd done. The toy box was eventually dismantled, the property stripped, the trailer removed, but the case remained open in other counties. The tapes and logs were stored in federal archives, still cross-referenced when unidentified remains are discovered in the Southwest. And the victims, those who lived and those who didn't, became permanent ghosts within a justice system that never found closure. The case is now used in training manuals, not as a model of investigation, but as a warning of what a person can do when no one is watching, when the target population is voiceless, when the killer is methodical, not monstrous. David Parker Ray didn't rage, he didn't snap, he built. And that makes him one of the most dangerous kinds of serial predators. Not the ones who lose control, but the ones who never needed it in the first place. While the desert silence of New Mexico concealed David Parker Ray's system of horror, in the wooded quiet of suburban Indiana, another predator was orchestrating his own version of methodical elimination, this time behind the walls of $1 million estate where the air smelled of pine mulch and trimmed lawns. There were no trailers, no escapees running through the dirt. There was only a house, large, gated, lined with evergreen trees and owned by a man who blended in so perfectly that neighbors described him as forgettable. But the bones beneath his backyard would eventually speak louder than the man ever did. Herb Baumeister didn't fit the visual mold of a serial killer. He was a married father, a businessman who operated a chain of thrift stores, and the type of person who rarely stirred suspicion. His life appeared boring, uneventful, stable, until bodies started turning up along Interstate 70, discarded with no clear pattern, no evidence trail, and no connection. At first, the killings were thought to be unrelated. The victims were young men, often gay, often transient, and often last seen at bars or clubs in the Indianapolis area. They vanished without sound, without struggle, without witnesses. But by the mid-90s, the Indiana State Police had begun linking the deaths together, not by cause or method, but by disposal. The remains, usually partial skeletons, appeared along the same corridor. And then the trail went cold. What investigators didn't know at the time was that while they searched for the killer along highways, the bodies weren't just being dumped there. They were being collected elsewhere, stripped of identity, and selectively scattered. Herb Baumeister's home was called Fox Hollow Farm, a sprawling property with acres of secluded forest, riding paths, and ornamental gardens. It was the kind of place where someone could bury a dozen bodies and still never have to walk over them. Baumeister targeted his victims primarily from gay bars in Indianapolis. He had a routine: approach, charm, offer a private drink or a swim, and invite them back to the estate. Once there, the isolation took over. No neighbors to hear anything. No visitors to interrupt. He would lead his victims to the indoor pool, offer drinks, and suggest games involving asphyxiation. Most didn't know how close they were to death until it was too late. Baumeister's signature wasn't messy. There was no blood, no knives, no weapons left behind. His method of killing was strangulation, often during erotic encounters, where consent was blurred just enough to ensure silence. He used his own hands, sometimes with a rope or pool hose, and disposed of the bodies in small wooded areas behind the main house, in shallow graves, or directly on the surface to decompose naturally. The technique worked for years. His family never knew. His business partners never asked questions. And the victims, like those of Ray, were people the system didn't search hard for. Some weren't reported missing at all. Others had families who filed reports, only to be told their loved one had probably left on their own. But the bodies kept turning up. The problem was they weren't tied together fast enough. Different jurisdictions, limited communication, victims that didn't fit the typical homicide template. It wasn't until a young man named Tony, who had been propositioned by Baumeister but declined the invitation, went to the police that a real lead opened up. He described the man, the car, the estate, but without a body, there was nothing concrete. Surveillance failed. Warrants stalled. and Baumeister continued operating with no interruption. It took a break in the chain: his wife. During a separation, she allowed police to search the property while Baumeister was away on vacation. What they found beneath the surface of Fox Hollow Farm was horrifying. More than 5,500 human bone fragments were scattered across the woods, backyard, and garden beds. Skulls, ribs, teeth, some partially intact, others reduced to ash and fragments. The remains of at least 11 individuals were recovered, though estimates place the real number far higher. He didn't bury them deep. He didn't need to. The forest took care of the rest. Wildlife and time acted as cleanup crews, and he rarely used the same area twice. His strategy wasn't to hide forever. It was to outlast interest. And for years, it worked. The moment police found the remains, Baumeister's name hit the airwaves. But he wasn't home. He had driven north into Canada, alone, checking into a motel under a fake name. Days later, he was found dead in his car from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. No trial, no statements, no final reckoning. Just silence, consistent with the way he'd lived and killed. The aftermath at Fox Hollow Farm was less about closure and more about confusion. Bones were found tangled in tree roots under gardening stones within feet of children's play areas. Some victims were identified through dental records. Others remained anonymous. The police set up temporary command posts on the property, bringing in forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs. The media flooded in. And yet, there was no clear narrative, no murder weapon, no journals, no direct admissions. Only bones, silence, and a killer who never needed to explain himself. The strangest part of Baumeister's profile was how calm he remained throughout his life. There were no signs of stress, no missed payments, no outbursts or arrests. He ran his business successfully. He paid his taxes. He smiled in photographs. And behind it all, he stacked bodies like cordwood, waiting for time to erase the evidence. If his wife hadn't made the call, he might have died a respected businessman with a yard full of bodies no one ever found. The Fox Hollow Farm case remains open for the unidentified victims. Some bones were too damaged to analyze. Others were never claimed. Today, the property has new owners, but stories continue to circulate. About screams in the woods, about sightings of shadows near the pool, about the weight of what happened there never quite leaving. Herb Baumeister wasn't a spree killer. He didn't rage. He selected, planned, and carried out his crimes with the calm of a man pruning weeds from a garden. And when it finally closed in on him, he didn't panic. He exited without a word, the same way he entered every victim's life, quietly. The investigation at Fox Hollow Farm didn't end with the discovery of remains or the suicide of Herb Baumeister. What followed was a methodical excavation that stretched over months, involving forensic anthropologists, pathologists, state police, and cadaver dogs combing through every inch of the property, looking for more than just bones. They were looking for patterns in disposal, spatial frequency, decomposition rates, and anything that might explain how so many people could die in one location without a single witness or report reaching the threshold of a full investigation until it was too late. The reality became clearer with each body part uncovered. Baumeister hadn't just committed murder. He had created a burial system. His estate was broken into segments, each section of the wooded property seemingly reserved for a specific dump site. Some remains were burned, others stripped of identifying features, and a few left partially buried, as if time alone would erase their existence. Among the most disturbing discoveries was how close these sites were to areas frequented by his own family. Children played in one section of the yard while bones lay exposed only feet away. Baumeister had built a double life so airtight that not even those sleeping under the same roof suspected what was happening outside their windows at night. Investigators began cross-referencing the bones with missing persons reports from the Indianapolis area, mostly gay men in their 20s who had last been seen in clubs and bars downtown. Only a handful of victims were ever conclusively identified. The rest remain unnamed, known only by fragment numbers and locations on a grid laid across the estate. The house itself offered little in the way of confession. No written records, no trophies, no photography. Baumeister had relied on memory and geography rather than keepsakes. He kept it clean, methodical, and detached. His psychological profile suggested not a sadist, but a compulsive controller, a man who compartmentalized his crimes so completely that the cognitive dissonance allowed him to murder one day and attend a PTA meeting the next. The case exposed the limitations of interjurisdictional cooperation in the 1990s, especially involving marginalized communities. Had the early disappearances been cross-referenced sooner, had data been centralized, the connective tissue between victims might have formed quicker. But in Baumeister's case, he benefited from the gaps in the system, the gaps in communication, the gaps in urgency when it came to missing gay men. Victims whose profiles didn't command national attention. His escape to Canada and subsequent suicide prevented the courts from ever hearing a full trial. There would be no timeline established in a courtroom, no motive explored through cross-examination, no justice rendered by jury. Just a sealed note found beside his body and the unfinished job of identification left to forensic scientists. The property was eventually sold, and today Fox Hollow Farm still stands. Residential, occupied, but soaked in history that won't dissipate. The new owners have spoken publicly about the experience. They've described strange noises, unexplained shadows, cold spots in the yard, and even finding leftover bone fragments years after the official investigation ended. Whether paranormal or psychological, the effect of living on that land remains persistent. The estate that once housed silent death now whispers constantly to those who remain. And in the shadows of that whisper, the legacy of Baumeister is not one of infamy or headlines, but of silence. Silence that lasted too long. Silence that was mistaken for normal. And silence that allowed a man to murder repeatedly while maintaining a reputation for mediocrity. The terror wasn't in his rage, it was in his restraint. He didn't lash out. He waited, selected, and struck without hesitation. Then he went back to work, back to dinner with his family, back to the ordinary rhythm of suburban camouflage. When the remains were finally tallied and the formal case file closed, the death toll was estimated at over 20, though unofficially it could be far higher. No one will ever know for sure. Like Ray before him, Baumeister left behind more questions than answers. Questions about who knew, who was missed, and how many more like him walk unnoticed through neighborhoods that seem safe. But if Ray built his horror into metal and tools, Baumeister wove his into the fabric of normal life, burying his crimes beneath the mulch of daily routine. And while the courts never held him accountable, his victims now exist in files, DNA registries, and rows of unidentified remains in Indiana morgues, waiting silently to be named. The idea that someone could do this much harm under the guise of normality wasn't new to law enforcement, but what came next pushed the pattern further, off the roads, into the offices, and through the daily machinery of logistics and planning. The next man didn't bury his victims in one place. He scattered them like waste, packed, sealed, and disposed of with such calculated efficiency that it took years before the pattern even emerged. His workspace wasn't a trailer or a mansion. It was the front seat of a car, a dark road, and the promise of a ride home. His name was Randy Kraft, and his method was numbers. Each body, another data point. Each kill, another line in a cryptic ledger that would become the Rosetta Stone to his trail of death. Randy Kraft didn't bury his victims. He cataloged them in a system so clean and so detached from emotion that by the time law enforcement understood the structure behind it, the body count had already passed double digits and kept rising. Unlike others who chose a single hunting ground or signature style, Kraft operated like a data-driven predator, fluid, adaptive, and disturbingly normal on the surface. He was intelligent, articulate, and outwardly unremarkable. A computer consultant, Air Force veteran, politically active, with no criminal history that drew serious attention. He lived in Southern California during a time when the region was already reeling from other serial killers, blending into the chaos of the era without ever making enough noise to raise alarms. But beneath the calm exterior was a precise machine of death. Kraft's victims were mostly young men, often hitchhikers, Marines, or men leaving bars late at night. He'd offer rides, sometimes pretending to be helpful, other times just seeming trustworthy. Once inside his car, the doors locked, the mood shifted. The victims were drugged, booze, pills, or both. And once they lost control, the torture began. Kraft didn't just kill, he documented. He photographed, he logged. His car became a mobile kill room, outfitted with supplies, binding tools, and a ritualistic pattern that repeated with alarming consistency. The bodies were later discovered discarded along roadsides, highways, embankments, stripped of identity, often mutilated, and occasionally marked with unusual post-mortem injuries. The details were brutal. Foreign objects inserted, limbs severed, internal damage inflicted in ways that seemed more experimental than rage-filled. And yet, Kraft left almost no trace of himself. No DNA, no fingerprints, no direct links. He was clinical, efficient, and most terrifying of all, unbothered. The authorities initially didn't realize they were dealing with a single killer. The victims showed varying degrees of mutilation, were found in different counties and states, and had no obvious connections. But in the background, Kraft kept a handwritten list, what came to be known as his scorecard, a cryptic ledger of 61 entries, each referring to a kill. The entries were coded phrases like Marine Disneyland or Golden Sailor, hints only Kraft understood. It was only discovered after his arrest, but once decrypted, it became a horrifying roadmap. Every line a death. Every line a body. Kraft had effectively gamified murder. He didn't kill because of impulse or passion. He killed because it fit into a structured world he had built, a ledger of elimination that required no emotion, only execution. Law enforcement only began piecing things together when a patrol officer pulled Kraft over for suspected drunk driving in 1983. Inside the car, the officer found a man slumped in the passenger seat, dead, with ligature marks around his neck. In the trunk, alcohol, drugs, photographs, and most damning of all, the list. That arrest ended Kraft's killing spree, but opened the gates to an investigation that would span years and multiple jurisdictions. Victims were matched to entries in the list. Old cases were re-examined, forensic evidence was revisited, and gradually the puzzle came together. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had refined his killing to a science. He tracked victims by time, location, and sometimes even method. He adjusted his style to avoid detection, and he kept everything mobile, never relying on a single place, a single method, or a single victim type to bind him. This made him a ghost in the system. For a long time, authorities assumed his killings were the work of multiple offenders. In reality, it was one man who had perfected the art of dissociation. And even after capture, Kraft didn't confess. He didn't weep, apologize, or explain. He simply maintained his innocence. But the evidence spoke louder. Dozens of photos, handwritten notes, drug paraphernalia, victim belongings, and the scorecard, his coded masterpiece, the final accounting of a trail that spanned over a decade and left a string of devastated families in its wake. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty. The trial was long, technical, and filled with expert testimony on the logistics of his kills. Kraft remained composed throughout, more annoyed by procedural delays than by the horrific charges stacked against him. He was convicted of 16 murders in 1989 and sentenced to death, though the number of victims attributed to him is likely far higher. His case is still studied in criminal profiling and forensic psychology programs, not just because of the brutality, but because of the logic. He showed how intelligence, planning, and emotional detachment could produce a killer who operated beneath the radar for years, even as his crimes escalated. And unlike many serial killers, Kraft wasn't undone by ego or mistake. He was caught on a fluke, a traffic stop that pulled back the curtain on a methodical spree of torture and murder stretching across multiple counties and state lines. His is not the story of a madman slipping up. It's the story of a machine that ran silently, efficiently, until someone accidentally hit the off switch. The scorecard remains the most chilling artifact of his case. Coded, calm, and clean. A list that turned lives into entries. A record of death, reduced to phrases scribbled in handwriting only he understood. Even now, some entries remain unsolved, some victims unnamed. They are entries without closure. And Kraft, sitting on death row in San Quentin, has never offered answers. He doesn't explain, he doesn't reveal, he waits like he always did. But his system, like the ones Ray and Baumeister built before him, remains one of the most calculated blueprints of modern serial murder ever uncovered. What set Kraft apart wasn't just what he did, it was how little emotion he attached to it. The complete absence of chaos, the presence of control, and the chilling realization that for years he was killing not out of rage, but out of routine. The most haunting aspect of Randy Kraft's legacy wasn't just the list of victims or the brutality of the killings, but the sheer scale of it. An operation so mobile, so efficient, and so invisible that by the time law enforcement realized they had a serial killer in their midst, he had already covered more distance and claimed more lives than almost any other known predator in California history. He didn't need a hiding place. His crime scenes were the roads themselves. He cruised along the Pacific Coast Highway, through Orange County, into Oregon, and even back to his own neighborhood, moving bodies like luggage, dumping them with mechanical detachment, and keeping careful notes in that now infamous scorecard. And though the list itself contained 61 coded entries, investigators believed that Kraft's actual victim count could exceed 70 or even 80. Each one carried away from their life and erased surgically from the map. What made him different wasn't the killing. It was the record-keeping. It was the index. That notebook became a master key to unlock the chaos. As forensic teams continued working backwards from the evidence in his vehicle, they began matching names to codes, piecing together the last known moments of young men who had vanished into the Southern California night, often last seen at gay bars, college campuses, military bases, or convenience stores. He preyed on the unnoticed, the vulnerable, the trusting. Most of his victims were drugged with prescription sedatives Kraft had obtained under false pretenses, drugs that suppressed memory and motor function but prolonged consciousness, making the torture last longer and the victim more aware, trapped in a nightmare with no exit. His vehicle was the crime scene, every inch optimized. Passenger seat removed for more space, carpet covered in DNA from multiple victims, trunk packed with ligatures, alcohol, and documentation. He had mastered the concept of mobile killing, never needing to return to a fixed location, always ready to adapt. He changed routes frequently. He adjusted his methods when investigations surfaced. He even worked with police volunteers on occasion, talking to officers, blending into law enforcement-friendly environments like parades, community drives, and local charity events. He wore the mask of social normalcy so well that even people who had dinner with him now question how they missed the signs. But the truth was, Kraft left no signs. He was calculated to the point of mechanical perfection. When trial proceedings began, the full extent of Kraft's depravity was laid bare. Photographs of victims in varying stages of distress, personal belongings collected as if souvenirs, and the patterns of sadism that emerged from post-mortem autopsies: legs mutilated, foreign objects inserted, genital mutilation, ligature strangulation, and sometimes forced ingestion of chemicals. His signature wasn't always the act of killing, but the manner in which he desecrated the body afterward, treating each victim like a test subject in an evolving experiment of pain. His trial was one of the longest and most expensive in California history at the time, involving multiple counties, dozens of witnesses, and over 50,000 pages of evidence. Jurors saw photographs that would never be released to the public due to their graphic nature. The prosecution painted Kraft as a remorseless sadist who killed for control, not thrill, and the defense struggled to present any coherent counter-narrative. There was no insanity plea. There was no emotional appeal. Kraft maintained silence, aside from minor procedural objections, as if the deaths he caused meant nothing more than lines on a sheet of paper. The verdict was inevitable, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin, where he remains to this day, rarely speaking, rarely writing, and never offering explanation. Investigators still attempt to match scorecard entries to unsolved cases, but some victims may never be identified. Bodies too decomposed, names too forgotten. And Kraft, knowing the system can't execute quickly, sits with the knowledge that much of what he did will remain his secret forever. The calculated nature of his crimes, the absence of rage, the presence of structure, placed him in a category apart from many serial killers. He wasn't driven by impulse, he was driven by method. He had mapped out murder as if it were logistics, treating victims as variables in an equation he controlled. There was no signature weapon, no singular pattern of injury, just a routine, a checklist, and the discipline to carry it out. And when he was done, he logged it, closed the file in his mind, and went on with his life. What frightened investigators the most was not the extent of the horror. It was how long it went unnoticed. How many bodies could have been avoided had someone seen the pattern earlier? How many names remained locked in that scorecard, never to be translated? Randy Kraft redefined the meaning of silent killer. He operated not in a frenzy, but with restraint. Not out of hatred, but out of process. And when it was all over, he vanished behind the prison walls like a bureaucrat closing out a file cabinet of corpses. His victims, mostly young men with dreams, families, and futures, now exist as numbers in a ledger that only Kraft can truly explain. The scars left behind are not just emotional or historical. They are systematic failures burned into the annals of criminal profiling. But as investigators closed Kraft's file and turned to new threats, another name began to surface. But if Randy Kraft operated like a mathematician of murder, turning victims into variables and roadsides into morgues, then what came next was something far older, far more visceral. It wasn't about lists, it wasn't about order, it was about mutilation. The next man wasn't content to kill, he needed to disassemble. to leave behind bodies so mutilated that even seasoned detectives were left numb in crime scenes soaked with brutality. While Kraft's car was his weapon, Richard Cottingham turned hotel rooms into slaughterhouses. His victims weren't logged and discarded. They were staged, displayed, and in many cases set on fire. He didn't want to disappear into the shadows. He wanted what he left behind to burn itself into the memory of anyone who saw it. He became known by the name the tabloids gave him, the Torso Killer. And what made him truly terrifying was that while bodies piled up in the 1970s, Richard Cottingham still managed to go home each night to a wife, a child, and a double life that even those closest to him never suspected. Richard Cottingham didn't just kill, he erased identity, he severed meaning, he turned murder into a spectacle of dismemberment so vile that first responders at his crime scenes often required psychological counseling after the initial walkthrough. Unlike Randy Kraft, who operated with statistical precision, Cottingham unleashed chaos and then left it to smolder. His reign began in the New York, New Jersey area during the 1970s. A time when urban law enforcement was stretched thin by serial crimes, drug wars, and a rising tide of unsolved homicides. Cottingham thrived in this entropy. He didn't need an alias. He didn't roam from coast to coast. He stayed close to home, working a stable job at Blue Cross Blue Shield, returning nightly to a suburban life with a wife and children, while spending his evenings cruising Manhattan's seedy corridors for victims he could lure into the void. Most of the women he targeted were sex workers or women alone in bars or diners, people he could isolate without raising alarm. Once captured, they were brought to hotel rooms, cotton-draped, low-rent rectangles that would be transformed into butcher shops. Cottingham's signature wasn't just violence, it was display. He removed heads and hands, severed limbs, and in many cases set the corpses on fire before checkout. Victims were often left posed, legs parted, arms arranged deliberately, and sometimes with remnants of bondage still attached. He left behind no IDs, no teeth, no fingerprints. The fire erased any residual evidence. Police were repeatedly faced with scorched torsos that offered no way to be identified, no hint at who they once were, just carbonized remains in a bed of blood and ash. For a long time, no one saw the pattern. Law enforcement didn't even classify the crimes as connected. The media dubbed him the Torso Killer, but even that name came years before Cottingham was actually arrested. And during those years, he operated freely, sometimes attacking women who survived, often escalating in brutality, but always walking away before sunrise. One victim was found in a motel bathtub, her hands hacked off at the wrist, her legs mutilated, and her body drained of blood. Another was discovered in a room still smoldering. Her corpse burned beyond recognition, but the fire contained enough to suggest it was ignited intentionally, and possibly while the victim was still alive. Cottingham, like many serial killers, relied on a mix of charm and power. He was confident enough to speak to his victims calmly, manipulative enough to gain their trust, and sadistic enough to take his time once he had them isolated. His method was always hands-on. He didn't rely on firearms or prefabricated tools. He used restraints, blades, and brute strength, often gagging his victims so tightly they suffered internal bleeding before he even laid a hand on them. When Cottingham was finally arrested in 1980, it wasn't due to a sting operation or a carefully crafted task force. It was because of screams. The night manager of a New Jersey motel heard a woman crying in pain from one of the rooms. Police responded and found Cottingham naked, covered in blood, with a drugged and brutalized woman tied to the bed. He claimed she was into kinky sex, but the crime scene told a different story. After his arrest, authorities began connecting dots. Photos found in his possession showed other women, some missing, some dead. His car contained traces of blood and fibers, and eventually, after years of resistance, Cottingham began to confess, not in remorse, but in detail. He described each kill like a craftsman recounting his work, calm, clinical, almost proud. He confessed to murders previously unsolved and hinted at others yet unknown. At trial, his courtroom demeanor was cold. He didn't flinch during victim statements. He didn't object to the evidence. He sat, eyes locked forward, as jurors were shown photos of women burned beyond recognition, of bloodstains soaked so deep into mattresses they were impossible to remove, of hotel receipts tied directly to his name. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But even after sentencing, Cottingham remained a dark fixture in the world of unsolved crimes. Jersey Motel heard a woman crying in pain from one of the rooms. Police responded and found Cottingham naked, covered in blood, with a drugged and brutalized woman tied to the bed. He claimed she was into kinky sex, but the crime scene told a different story. After his arrest, authorities began connecting dots. Photos found in his possession showed other women, some missing, some dead. His car contained traces of blood and fibers, and eventually, after years of resistance, Cottingham began to confess, not in remorse, but in detail. He described each kill like a craftsman recounting his work, calm, clinical, almost proud. He confessed to murders previously unsolved and hinted at others yet unknown. At trial, his courtroom demeanor was cold. He didn't flinch during victim statements. He didn't object to the evidence. He sat, eyes locked forward, as jurors were shown photos of women burned beyond recognition, of bloodstains soaked so deep into mattresses they were impossible to remove, of hotel receipts tied directly to his name. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But even after sentencing, Cottingham remained a dark fixture in the world of unsolved crimes. Over the decades, more murders were linked to him, some via confessions, others through DNA advancements. And with each new victim identified, the full scale of his horror came further into focus. What set him apart was not just the violence, but the cold artistry behind it, the way he planned, prepared, and staged. Even other serial killers studied Cottingham. His ability to conceal identity was nearly unmatched. His crimes showed how a predator could thrive in plain sight, maintain a job, a marriage, a family, and still kill with such savagery that decades later, detectives still wince at the crime scene photos. But while Cottingham's confessions helped solve old cases, they also revealed one of the most disturbing truths of all. He didn't remember all of them. He had killed so many women so often that even he had lost track. The torso killer wasn't just a name, it was a category, a compartment in the brain where empathy was discarded and identity didn't matter. Just flesh, just parts. And Cottingham, now in his 70s, locked away for life, continues to confess, casually, as if listing memories from vacations long past. And yet, for all the victims confirmed, for all the evidence logged, the true count may never be known. He's suspected of killing over 100 women. And many of those women, their names, their faces, their stories were never recorded. They died in rooms that burned, their identities turned to soot, their existence wiped from the map by one man who saw them as disposable. Richard Cottingham wasn't a spree killer or a madman with an impulse. He was a sustained terror, a long-haul butcher who learned early how to balance a home life with hidden horror. And he showed that the most horrifying predators aren't the ones who scream or lash out. They're the ones who smile, who blend in, and who kill with purpose. Long after the verdicts were read and the media cycle faded, Richard Cottingham remained a fixture in the nightmares of law enforcement. He didn't vanish like most serial killers sentenced to life. He lingered like rot in the walls of justice. Even behind bars, he kept speaking, answering letters from investigators, giving interviews, and slowly peeling back layers of his own darkness. But Cottingham didn't confess out of guilt. He confessed out of control. He still wanted to shape the narrative. He still wanted to be the one turning the page. And as he named victims, sometimes decades after their deaths, detectives were forced to exhume cases long considered unsolvable. Cold cases thawed, missing persons reports cross-referenced with his notes, hotel ledgers, and grainy black and white photographs recovered from storage units and crawl spaces. His admissions helped clear multiple unsolved homicides, but they also raised haunting questions. How many of his victims died before serial profiling was even a practice? How many women vanished without a trace in the years before DNA testing existed? Cottingham's true impact remains unknowable, hidden beneath his fragmented memory and the ashes of the hotel rooms he burned. He murdered without consistency, without signature, sometimes using fire, sometimes blades, sometimes restraints. What tied his victims together wasn't method, it was mutilation. It was the stripping away of identity and the deliberate crafting of anonymity. When Cottingham severed hands and decapitated bodies, he wasn't just erasing evidence. He was erasing the concept of personhood, and this made him nearly impossible to trace for years. The few who survived him, women who were drugged but managed to flee or were left for dead but lived, often suffered from such trauma they couldn't describe their attacker. Cottingham worked in shadows, with just enough calculation to outpace the forensics of his time. When DNA finally caught up with him, it confirmed what seasoned detectives already knew. This wasn't a case of a few misfires or escalating rage. This was a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior masked behind the suburban camouflage of a family man. In interviews, Cottingham didn't display remorse. He discussed dismemberment the way someone might describe rebuilding a car engine, calm, technical, and disturbingly detached. He recounted where he bought his tools, how he selected hotels that had poor surveillance, and how he learned to control victims without alerting front desk clerks. He knew the geography of crime like a native, and he knew when to walk away. His ability to compartmentalize, to murder, and then return home for dinner left investigators grappling with the terrifying truth that some of the most dangerous men are the ones who appear entirely ordinary. Cottingham's legacy has become a case study in profiling, used to train new generations of law enforcement on how killers adapt to the gaps in the system. But as his time fades into prison routine, the echoes of what he did continue to reverberate through cold case units and missing persons databases across the East Coast. Some of his confessions have helped families find closure. Others have only deepened the wound, offering confirmation without answers. Who were the women he burned so thoroughly that even their bones were indistinguishable? What names remain buried in boxes of unsolved evidence waiting for a match that may never come? Cottingham offered no comfort. He confessed on his terms. And as each year passed, he reminded the world that justice, while served, did not come complete. His existence in prison serves not just as punishment, but as a dark monument to how far a killer can go when his mask never slips. But while Cottingham's victims were often lost to fire and surgical violence, the next killer left his victims in plain sight, not scattered across states, not buried in deep woods, but rotting in his own home, their smell so potent that neighbors complained for years, and no one acted. What followed Richard Cottingham wasn't cleaner, it was messier. It wasn't strategic, it was festering, and its horror lay not in concealment, but in neglect. In a city neighborhood where residents had grown used to ignoring the stink of decay, one man buried his sickness inside walls, under floors, and behind padlocked doors. Anthony Sowell didn't want to erase identity. He wanted to trap it, cage it, let it rot where no one would intervene. And for a long time, nobody did. Because in the forgotten streets of Cleveland, horror doesn't always have to hide. Sometimes it just has to smell familiar. Anthony Sowell didn't live in the shadows. He lived in broad daylight, in a house on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, where the stench of death wasn't hidden but hung heavy in the summer air, wafting through windows and clinging to the alleys like a curse that no one dared to name. For years, neighbors complained of the smell. Some thought it was rotting meat from the nearby sausage factory. Others guessed at a sewage backup or animal remains. But few imagined what was behind the peeling walls and boarded-up windows of 12,205 Imperial Avenue. The truth was far more disturbing. Anthony Sowell wasn't moving bodies. He was storing them, piling them, letting them fester in closets, crawl spaces, and shallow backyard graves. The first clue came in 2009, when police came to the house with a warrant to arrest him for a rape accusation. What they expected was a confrontation. What they found instead was a house of decay. The moment they stepped inside, the odor overwhelmed them. Thick, chemical, unmistakably organic. Investigators followed the smell to the upstairs bedroom, where they found the decomposed remains of two women lying side by side on the floor, wrapped in layers of plastic and blankets, like discarded furniture. Downstairs, in the basement, more bodies were stacked in various stages of decomposition. In the backyard, bones protruded from makeshift burial mounds. By the time the search was complete, 11 women had been found, 11 victims, all black, all vulnerable, all ignored. Some had been missing for months, others for years, and every one of them had died in the same house, under the same roof, while their families searched and the neighborhood shrugged. Sowell's method was disturbingly simple. He lured women with promises of alcohol, drugs, or simply shelter. Many of his victims were battling addiction or living on the margins, easy targets in a system that barely registered their absence. Once inside, Sowell overpowered them, often strangling them with his bare hands or with ligatures improvised from household items. Some were raped, others were beaten, but all were discarded with the same indifference, left in corners, shoved into garbage bags, hidden behind furniture, or buried in shallow pits. What shocked investigators wasn't just the brutality, it was the duration. These weren't killings that happened over weeks or months. Sowell operated for at least 4 years, uninterrupted, undetected. The smell was there the entire time. Complaints were filed. City workers visited. Nothing was done. Landlords looked the other way. Neighbors became desensitized. And in that silence, he thrived. The house became a tomb with an open door. When forensics teams began documenting the crime scene, they were forced to wear hazmat suits. The walls were stained, the floorboards warped, insects swarmed every surface. Sowell had continued living among the remains, eating, sleeping, even inviting new victims into the same rooms where bodies already lay hidden. His detachment was total. He treated the corpses like clutter, never moving them unless necessary, never showing any sign that he understood what he had done. Interviews with those who knew him painted a picture of a man who was quiet, reserved, sometimes strange, but never overtly threatening. He had served time for attempted rape in the 1980s. He was a registered sex offender, but no one believed he was a serial killer. He played chess with neighbors. He waved to people on the sidewalk. He lived close to a school, a church, a corner store, always visible, always present. and yet no one saw what was happening behind the boarded windows. When he was finally arrested, Sowell showed little emotion. He denied nothing, but offered no explanations. In the interrogation room, he spoke in short, clipped sentences. He didn't ask about the charges, he didn't ask about the victims. He just sat as if waiting for the routine to begin. His trial revealed a pattern not just of murder, but of systemic failure. Multiple women had reported violent encounters with Sowell before. Some had escaped. Some had gone to the police, but their stories weren't followed up. Their cases weren't prioritized. Many were drug users or had criminal records themselves. They weren't seen as credible. And so Sowell continued. The city of Cleveland came under scrutiny. Why weren't the complaints taken seriously? Why weren't the missing persons reports connected sooner? Why did it take a rape accusation in 2009 to uncover 4 years of serial murder? The answers were vague. Miscommunication, understaffing, oversight. But for the families of the victims, those weren't answers at all. The trial was brutal. Jurors were shown photos of the bodies, some barely recognizable, some mummified. The prosecution outlined each murder, each burial, each ignored warning. Sowell's defense didn't argue innocence. They argued mental illness, but the jury didn't accept it. The verdict was guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. But even as the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the house on Imperial Avenue remained. Vacant, condemned, a monument to what had been ignored for too long. It was eventually demolished. But the damage had already been done. 11 women had died not in secret, but in plain view. Killed by a man whose evil was as quiet as it was persistent, whose crimes were made possible not just by his own darkness, but by a world that didn't bother to look. And he wasn't done being analyzed, because even with his conviction, the psychological profile of Anthony Sowell defied expectations. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't methodical. He was sloppy. He made mistakes. And yet no one stopped him. Because the people he targeted were the kind of people no one searched for. His victims weren't just murdered. They were erased. As the trial concluded and Anthony Sowell was led out in chains, the weight of his crimes still hung over Cleveland like a foul stench that no longer came from his house, but from the legacy of neglect and failure that let him operate in the first place. The investigation into the Imperial Avenue murders wasn't just about identifying victims or cataloging remains. It became a case study in systemic collapse. Each victim had a story. Each had people who noticed their disappearance. But in every instance, their vanishing was met with silence. Police reports went unfiled or unattended. Tips weren't followed. DNA evidence sat unprocessed. One woman had filed a missing persons report on her sister 3 times before anyone listened. Another had visited the house with a friend shortly before she vanished. Her scent, her DNA, her fingerprints later found in Sowell's bedroom. But no one had responded to her family's desperate pleas for help. What became clear was that Anthony Sowell didn't need to be a master manipulator. He simply needed time. And time was what the city gave him over and over again. While the bodies decomposed in his home, a routine bureaucracy kept moving. No major search parties were launched. No connections made between the women who disappeared within blocks of one another. It was as if the very machinery meant to protect them had been designed to forget them. And in that vacuum, Sowell built a kingdom of rot. Inside the house, forensic investigators documented the scene with clinical horror. The living room, once a space for guests, had been converted into a labyrinth of filth, clothing, trash, broken furniture, and air so saturated with decay that even seasoned crime scene techs struggled to breathe. Upstairs, bodies were found in the fetal position. Others spread flat, their arms crossed over their chests as if in ritual. Some were wrapped in blankets or sheets, suggesting a crude burial respect that clashed violently with the conditions in which they were left. Beneath the stairs, a skull was discovered tucked behind a panel. In the backyard, dogs had dug into shallow graves and pulled bones into the open. The remains weren't preserved. They were dumped, left to rot, fed on by insects and weather. Sowell didn't conceal them because he didn't have to. No one was coming. And even when they did, the full magnitude of his operation wasn't discovered in a day. It took weeks of excavation, sifting through soil and dismantling the house room by room, peeling back years of horror one layer at a time. By then, media attention had swelled. Protesters gathered, journalists circled, families of missing women brought photos, hoping for confirmation or closure. Some found it, others never did. In the months following his arrest, the city conducted internal reviews and investigations, but the damage was irreversible. Sowell had exposed a blind spot in law enforcement that went beyond incompetence. It was a cultural blindness, a belief that some victims simply didn't matter as much. His crimes forced a public reckoning. The question wasn't just how he got away with it, but why no one cared sooner. The surviving family members demanded accountability. Vigils were held, foundations were started. The neighborhood tried to reclaim its dignity. But the house, even after demolition, remained a scar. A plaque was placed where it once stood, listing the names of the 11 women whose remains were recovered. But for many, the gesture was too late. During his incarceration, Sowell gave no significant statements. He didn't show remorse. He didn't plead for leniency. He barely spoke at all. Psychiatrists examined him. Some diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. Others saw signs of schizophrenia or post-traumatic trauma. But none of it explained how he could live among death for so long without breaking. He didn't keep trophies. He didn't revisit graves. He simply collected, stored, and moved on. His routine continued. He woke, he ate, he drank, and if a neighbor stopped by, he might wave. The banality of his life was its most terrifying feature. This wasn't a man raging against society. This was a man existing comfortably within it while committing acts that should have alerted every possible authority. And yet, they didn't. One former neighbor described the house as a graveyard with a front porch light. The metaphor stuck because the light was always on. People walked by it every day. Delivery drivers, social workers, meter readers, and no one imagined what was inside. In the years that followed, efforts were made to overhaul missing persons protocols in Cleveland. Task forces were created. DNA labs were expanded. But for many residents, the changes felt cosmetic, because what Anthony Sowell exploited wasn't just process. It was indifference. He used addiction as a shield, poverty as camouflage, and the system's own apathy as a weapon. Every victim had a mother, a friend, a sibling who cared, but their cries weren't loud enough, and in the quiet, Sowell strangled them one by one, then left them where they lay. With each newly identified body, more details emerged. One woman had been strangled with an extension cord, her body wedged behind a wall. Another was tied to a mattress frame, her wrists bruised, her neck snapped. The remains were so degraded in some cases that cause of death was never fully determined. The heat inside the house accelerated decomposition, turning flesh to sludge. Investigators worked 12-hour shifts just to process one room at a time. And still, the true count of his victims remains uncertain. Some believe there may be more buried in nearby lots or dumped in areas not yet searched. But the case was closed with 11 names, 11 death certificates, 11 quiet disappearances in a city that didn't know it was harboring one of the most prolific serial killers in its history. The legacy of Anthony Sowell is not just measured by the number of women he killed, but by the silence that allowed him to keep killing. Even after his death sentence was handed down, and even as his name faded from headlines, what remained was a house that had once been a graveyard, a neighborhood once used to the sound of sirens, the scent of death, and the absence of justice. The final chapter of the Cleveland Strangler wasn't written in the courtroom or the prison yard, but in the quiet dissection of everything that went wrong. The unanswered 911 calls, the police reports filed and forgotten, the missing person posters that weathered in the rain, while 11 bodies decomposed in the heart of a city. For those who lived near him, the horror was not just in what was discovered, it was in how long it went unnoticed. Families of the victims told of sleepless nights, of unanswered voicemails left at precincts, of their own informal search parties combing through alleys while officers filed paperwork. When the bodies were finally recovered, many had to be identified by dental records or fragments of bone. A few had no next of kin to claim them. Their funerals were quiet, city-funded, attended by strangers who carried candles and whispered names that never made national news. Sowell died in 2021, not by execution, but from a terminal illness while on death row. There were no final confessions, no remorse, just the closing of a file and the slow decay of a building that had already been condemned in every sense of the word. He left no journal, no manifesto, only victims, only rot, and only questions that may never be answered. The most chilling aspect of his case was not his method, it was its effectiveness. He didn't move from state to state. He didn't bury his victims in forests. He didn't taunt police or collect trophies. He simply let the bodies accumulate, relying on apathy as his only disguise. The women he killed were not unknown, they were uncounted. And in that absence of counting, he found space to kill again and again. Even the demolition of his home became symbolic. Bulldozers leveled it under the weight of news cameras and grieving relatives, but the soil beneath remained soaked with the memory of failure. A memorial was erected, but many said it wasn't enough. Not for 11 lives, not for 11 families. The community surrounding Imperial Avenue still bears the scar. And in the years that followed, the term Cleveland Strangler became shorthand for systemic collapse. A reminder that a killer doesn't need brilliance to evade capture, only proximity to indifference. In classrooms where criminal justice is taught, Sowell's case is now used not for his pathology, but for the bureaucratic blind spots that allowed him to persist. His crimes forced Cleveland to change. New procedures for tracking missing persons, better cross-agency communication, increased scrutiny of complaints. But for many, those changes were too late. The horror had already seeped into the foundation of the city, and it would take more than policy to purge it. For true crime audiences, Sowell's case is often cited as among the most haunting, not because of the number of victims, but because of the slow, relentless normalcy of his routine. He walked to the store, he greeted neighbors, he sat on his porch drinking from paper cups while corpses decayed inside. His story reads like a quiet apocalypse, no grand event, just the steady erosion of humanity, one life at a time. The fact that it happened in the open, with so many chances to intervene, makes it all the more devastating. And it draws a final, painful line through all the killers featured in this script, from David Parker Ray's Dungeon of Depravity, to Herb Baumeister's Haunted Estate, to Terry Blair's Controlled Fury, to Richard Cottingham's Dismembered Secrets. Each man left behind carnage, but only Sowell left behind a house still echoing with the failure to act. In the end, serial killers do not thrive in darkness alone. They thrive where systems fail, where neighbors stop asking questions, where cries go unheard, and where justice, delayed long enough, becomes permission. This was not just a story about murder. It was a story about what we choose not to see, and what the cost of that blindness can be. 11 women lost their lives in that house, but countless others were failed long before the first murder ever took place. And in that failure, Anthony's soul built his graveyard, one victim at a time,